and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's pretty much all you need to know about me. This episode is a little bit different. I'm doing a one-off special, although the special episodes may become a thing in the future, but let's not run before we can walk. Just reacting to the news that Danny Boyle is no longer going to be directing the 25th James Bond film. That news came out the day before this podcast has been recorded. And the creative differences have been cited as a reason for the news. So the news was put out an official statement on the 007 Twitter feed. And interestingly, it was signed by Michael G. Wilson, Barbara Broccoli and Daniel Craig, which gives you a firm idea of the power of Daniel Craig as a creative force in the midst of the James Bond franchise. But what I wanted to talk about actually was Skyfall, because I've talked about Spectre on this podcast a few episodes back, but I can't help thinking that the story of the James Bond movie franchise has been permanently altered, really, by what happened with Skyfall, the production of it, the aftermath of it, and how that changed expectations. To put this into some degree of context, the James Bond films of the 1990s, the Pierce Brosnan movies, gradually saw an increase in box office returns. That each subsequent film, I Die Another Day may be the exception to this, but each subsequent film saw an increase in box office revenue, even as the films, you could charitably say in some cases, didn't necessarily improve. Indeed, Brosnan, off the back of Die Another Day, there was conversations, if you remember, about Halle Berry's character Jinx from that film being given her own spin-off movie, and that apparently got quite a way into discussion and development, to the point where it was seriously being considered, and to the point where eventually it was creative differences that stopped that project going ahead, and instead Eon Productions opted to look to film the new James Bond film in 2005. Now, that new James Bond film wouldn't involve Pierce Brosnan. The original intention was, I gather, that he would go on and do another film, but instead a new James Bond was cast, that man of course being Daniel Craig. And it's easy, and I'll probably come to this in a future podcast, so I won't go too deep into this at the moment, but it's easy to forget now just what a controversial casting choice Daniel Craig was in the role. The whole James Blonde, the gags that were doing the rounds at the time, the press launch where he was brought looking a little bit shaky on a boat to meet the press and announced as the new James Bond that way. But he signed up to do Casino Royale. Casino Royale went on to be a sizable hit, a 15 certificate sizable hit as well. The box office continued to go north. And then they moved quickly into Quantum of Solace. Now, the story of Quantum of Solace, again, is one for a future podcast, but it's little secret that was a film that was caught up in the middle of the writer's strike that was going on at the time, and you can kind of tell by the by the less than impressive story, really, that film had all sorts of problems behind the scenes, and I don't think anyone was particularly happy with it. I also think that the editing of the opening sequence was at the peak of over-editing action movies, to the point where you couldn't see what was going on. That everyone was kind of imitate the Jason Bourne style at that point, but not necessarily being able to capture what Paul Greengrass could do with those movies. And then we move forward to Skyfall, and lots of things were going on in the background of Skyfall. Skyfall then was Daniel Craig's third James Bond movie. There was a gap following Quantum of Solace as well, whereas Quantum of Solace followed Casino Royale quite quickly. There was a few years from Quantum of Solace to Skyfall. But there are a couple of things going on in the background. So Quantum of Solace, after the release of Quantum of Solace in 2008, Sam Mendes was identified as the director that they wanted, and he duly signed up for the movie. But Against the backdrop of Skyfall being made were serious financial problems with parent company MGM. And MGM being one of the forces behind the Bond franchise, to the point where, this threatened the Hobbit movies as well. If you remember, Guillermo del Toro quit the Hobbit films over the delays, because just getting the finances together to make them was causing all sorts of problems. And Skyfall was caught slap bang in the middle of that, to the point where the development on the project was outright suspended at one point. Peter Morgan was originally due to pen the script for Skyfall, and he left during the suspension of production of the movie. And in the end, the script was put together by regular Bond writers Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, along with John Logan. Filming eventually began in November of 2011. And when we talked Spectre, we talked about the 11th month rush to start and finish and release a Bond film. And Skyfall was exactly the same. What was different with Skyfall, though, was to a degree it was hostage of circumstance, in that, by definition of the financial pressures MGM was under, the decision was made to make Skyfall a far more UK-centric film. It's the tradition of the Bond movies that they travel the world, and Spectre, the subsequent film, would really earn plenty of stamps on its passport. But in the case of Skyfall, the vast majority of it was actually centred in the UK, and the story was a little more contained as a consequence of that, and I'd argue very much to the film's advantage. Daniel Craig, Javier Bardem, Ralph Fiennes, Naomi Harris, Ben Whishaw, Berenice Marlowe, Albert Finney, Judi Dench rounded out the cast. Filming began, and the film came together on time, after originally being announced at a press conference. I think it was the start of November 2011. The shoot was scheduled to take 133 days, and came in just a little ahead of that. It didn't have the same issue of Daniel Craig having an injury as he had on Spectre. And filming ran through to May of the following year. And there was a little bit of time to put the edit together. And when the film was put together, clearly having so much of it based in the UK was to the advantage. Also, focusing in on the character of M so much was to its advantage. And the film earns stellar reviews. Just an absolute phenomenon. I remember Barry Norman talking about Skyfall and arguing that Quantum of Solace was the worst Bond film, followed by Skyfall, which was the best Bond film. And here was a Bond film that's getting 5-star reviews, and appreciating some people don't have as much affection for Skyfall as others. I still think it really stands up. I think it's a really strong, enjoyable Bond movie. As is common with most Bond movies, it goes on, modern Bond movies anyway, it goes on a little bit too long. But conversely, I just think it's a raging success. But here was the crucial thing, and this is the shadow that I think has been over the James Bond franchise ever since. It earned an absolute fortune and smashed the ceiling for what was thought a James Bond movie could take at the box office. And I don't think you can underplay the money element of this. Skyfall at the box office earned $1.1 billion. $1.1 billion. It was an absolutely gigantic hit. It was the biggest grossing James Bond film of all time. It's one of the biggest grossing UK films of all time. And it was just an absolute juggernaut. And as a consequence of that, it really changed the perspective, I think, of what a Bond film could do. So let's just put it into some degree of context. Quantum of Solace, the film that had preceded it, again, whatever you think of the film, it still brought in just shy of $600 million worldwide. Casino Royale, it eclipsed Casino Royale's box office, $599 million worldwide. Die Another Day, $431 million worldwide. I just want to get across the fact this was not a small jump that it made. You know, it made $500 million more than any James Bond film had made before. And once the bar has been set at that level, I just think the playing field completely changed, because once you've had one success at that level, inevitably it comes to a point. It's like, well, we want another one, and let's look too at the kind of complicated distribution behind a James Bond film, in that Sony Pictures was holding the distribution rights for cinema release, but it didn't have the home entertainment release. So this was running through Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, and Spectre. And recently, for the next James Bond film, the distribution is now with Universal for theatrical. But the disc release rights are with 20th Century Fox through their MGM deal. And so Sony was not really making an awful lot of money once it had stumped up its part of the production budget. And so, whilst it was a hugely profitable enterprise for pretty much everyone on Skyfall, given that film came in at $150 million, the huge pressure was on Spectre to replicate that. Spectre then went all round the world. Spectre cost apparently about $250 million to make. It's the most expensive James Bond film to make. But its box office, whilst high, and it shouldn't be underplayed how high it is, came at $880 million worldwide. So huge amount, but again, what's that? $200 million down on Skyfall, and crucially also $100 million down just in the US. So whereas Skyfall broke $300 million, Spectre just about crossed $200 million in America. That Spectre was still this great big huge film. It just wasn't as huge as the one that went before. And so as a consequence, just even setting aside the critical reaction to Spectre, which I've discussed before, it was classed to some degree as a disappointment that this film that took $880 million at the global box office was a disappointment. And off the back of Spectre, of course, Sam Mendes, who'd returned after originally not going to come back to direct his second James Bond film, he pretty much instantly confirmed, I won't be back for another. There was wide speculation for a long time that Daniel Craig wouldn't be back for another. He hardly made the most encouraging noises that he would return. And there was a feeling that perhaps in the aftermath of Spectre, it was time for Bond to reboot again. And so we got the usual stories of Tom Hiddleston at one point was the bookie's favourite. Idris Elba's name has just spiked up over the last few weeks as well. But when it came to putting James Bond 25 together, it was eventually confirmed by Daniel Craig that he would return, and it's widely expected that this will be his last outing. Now that's putting all sorts of pressures on this film. So first of all, you've got Daniel Craig clearly wanting to go out with a bang, and he's now had an extensive run as James Bond. He's been in the role for well over a decade, even though that's only crossed 4 films so far, a 5th by the end of next year, unless the release date changes. But also there's this pressure to match up to what Skyfall did, because that's now the yardstick, I believe, by which James Bond films are being measured. And so attracting Danny Boyle to direct the film, I thought was quite a coup. But Danny Boyle has admitted in the past he's not one for a heavy studio environment. I mean, he looked at one point that he was going to direct Alien Resurrection, but always got the sense that he couldn't make that a Danny Boyle film, and so he wasn't that keen to do it. He's openly admitted he's only done one film as a director for hire. And that film was Steve Jobs, and he came in late in the day when David Fincher wasn't directing that film, but there was an Aaron Sorkin script in place, and he thought, yeah, I'll give that a go. But mostly Danny Boyle actively develops his own projects, and as was the case with James Bond 25, that he worked with his regular screenwriting collaborator John Hodge. They came out with a direction that they wanted to take the film, and it looked like full steam ahead. That filming would begin on James Bond 25 later this year with Boyle directing. And it's interesting that creative differences have come up as the reason, and it's interesting that Daniel Craig has signed that statement as well, because I just think there's I don't think there's room really for Bond to be experimental now. I think as the box office grew, I do think this all started with the Brosnan era, as the box office grew at that point. But conversely, I also think that it's what's happened in Daniel Craig's tenure and the size that James Bond movies have become in an era where there are fewer and fewer dependable blockbuster franchises. I just think that the wiggle room for risk is reducing. producing. And it's interesting. I mean, this all comes after Mission Impossible Fallout this summer. 2.5 hours of very, very, very intense physical action sequences, and there's a feeling from some that's kind of taken James Bond's mantle off it. And of course, the Bond franchise has been down this road before. It's seen the threat from True Lies. I remember how that was going to redefine what a James Bond film was. It's seen the threat from Jason Bourne, and the Bond franchise continually reinvents itself. But I wonder, is the wiggle room there to be really creative and interesting with it now? Is what Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson looking for is a very traditional, high stakes James Bond thrill packed movie, but not one that can take the authorship of such an individual director as Danny Boyle. And I think Danny Boyle's moment to make a James Bond film would have been in the aftermath of Quantum of Solace, when I think the franchise was in a funk. The film wasn't good. There were problems, and that's when they got someone as individual as Sam Mendes in to put a stamp on it, and Mendes duly did. But I do think the work that he's done has redefined what a Bond film needs to be for all the investors. I imagine Universal's deal is very cash rich, and they'll be looking to get an awful lot of return on it. And as a consequence, we find ourselves in this position now where James Bond 25 has just lost a really interesting director. And this is at a point, I think if you go back to the Brosnan films, interesting directors were hired, but they only really got to make the first half of the film before it's handed over to the stunt and second unit for the second half. I know that's a really simplistic view. I know there's an awful lot more to it than that, but I say that just as someone watching the films. And just kind of, I mean, Die Another Day from Lee Tamahori and Once Were Warriors, what a film. But the first half of that film threatens to go in really interesting places. The second half is just, as Vic Armstrong would say, it just looks wrong in certain places. It just becomes this strange, fairly generic action film. Where James Bond 25 goes from this point, don't know. Will they take the safe choice as a director hire? I think, on the one hand, I don't think they can afford to do that, because I think it took a bold choice of director. I mean, Sam Mendes, American Beauty, who would have thought, who would have tied that to James Bond at that point? But I think it's going to take a bold choice of director to really make the Bond franchise at a point where it's under some pressure again, take the 3 steps forward it arguably needs to make. I wonder if Eon may go for a much safer choice. I think that certainly the likelihood is that they'll go for a much more in-line choice. And I think it's a pity that we don't really get to see what Danny Boyle would do or could do with a James Bond film. And I think, and it is just my theory, at the heart of it, it's Skyfall that might just be to blame. This has been a one-off, unless there are more of them. I keep that caveat and asterisk in, special of the Film Stories podcast, which, as a rule, comes out every Monday, and we'll be back next Monday with more. It's just a small podcast. It's just a man in a room warbling into an increasingly expensive microphone as the cheaper ones conk out. If you can give this podcast any oxygen, there's my phone too. If you can give this podcast any oxygen, it's hugely appreciated. I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. The podcast is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod, and I'll be back next week with the regular episode of Film Stories. Take care.